Hello everyone, so I'm recording this video the day I published my BBCAN1 review retrospective video, and now that I am fresh on a rewatch, I'm going to delve into the players as players and rank them based off their capabilities that they showed in the game, and I'm going to do this based off of competition wins, slightly strategic acumen, social acumen, whether they benefited from luck or conveniences or not, and how well I think they would do if they were placed on any other season. I'm going to use the same tiers that I used in my Total Drama Players gameplay ranking. So, the first tier is Abysmal, the second tier is Bad, the third tier is people who I think have potential, the fourth tier is Mediocre, the fifth tier is Solid, the sixth tier is Good, and the final tier is Great. So we are starting off the Abysmal tier, and I'm going to start with Danielle, who I place as 15th, as I think she's the worst player of the season. So she was on the outs from the very beginning of the game, and was only close to Gary and Suzette during her time in the game, strategically and socially. She knew she was on the outs, but she was more focused on the pettiness between Jillian about Emmett. She ended up volunteering to go on the block, knowing that she was a potential target for Jillian and thinking that it would ease tension, but it just made it easier for Jillian and the others to get rid of her. She didn't campaign to stay in the house, and she felt way too comfortable in the fact that she was staying. She clearly knew nothing about the game, she didn't really care much about the game, and she was a bit too emotional. I don't see her doing well if she was placed on any other season, just due to her lack of gameplay acumen, social skills, and the ability to blend in with the others, tone herself down, and to really get her head in the game. So, at 14th place, and the final person in the abysmal category, is Suzette. She is higher than Danielle because she made it a few rounds further, and we do actually see her make some moves in the game. So, she ends up getting the first HOH, and she does make a big move in nominating the two strong men in Tom and Emmett, but the issue is she didn't stick to it, making her HOH completely pointless and obviously making Tom and Emmett mad at her for the rest of her time in the game. She ended up targeting Kat after the latter tried giving her good advice and trying to game talk with her, and Suzette would end up revealing in her goodbye message to Kat that she regrets taking her out. She ends up secluding herself with Gary and Danielle for most of the first 2 weeks and struggled with bonding with the others strategically and personally, and she would take some low blows at the other house guests due to this. She became an emotional and volatile mess when the opposition, aka Tom, won HOH. She snapped at Anil and called Tom a redneck. She was saved from certain eviction with the forced Canada's veto, and only wasn't targeted the next week because the house got sick of Tom and Liza, and she was a pawn to go at Liza against. The house didn't want her in jury and unanimously agreed to get her out, despite her being no threat to anyone. And the house felt like she was guilt-tripping them with her personal stories. So she benefited from luck and the convenience of having the forced Canada's veto being used on her, where she would have been a week 3 boot instead, and might have been lower than Danielle, had that not happened, so she was given an extra 2 weeks and didn't maximize it at all. Despite that, she was at least aware that she was playing a game compared to Danielle, but I don't think she would do well if she was placed on any other season, due to the reasons why I explained earlier. So the next tier is the bad tier. So these people clearly aren't good at the game and made a lot of poor choices, but they aren't the worst of the worst, hence them being in this tier and being a separate tier than the people who are in the abysmal tier. So the first person in this tier at 13th place is Kat. Honestly, there isn't much to go off of at all. She tried to campaign with and strategize with Suzette, but it cost the latter to nominate her. It would have benefited Suzette to work with Kat, but the fact that Kat turned Suzette off to the point of nominating her is not a good sign, clearly. And also, there's little points in the edit where you can clearly see that she wasn't close to anyone, and it seemed like she became an outcast very early on. and the fact that she was such a sole outcast might have played a part as to why Suzette felt like she could nominate and get rid of Kat. She seemed like she was a bit too aggressive and couldn't tone herself down to fit in with the house, but she was also a bit too threatening compared to some of the other outsiders where they wanted to get rid of her immediately. So at 12th place, I am putting AJ here, and some may find this to be pretty low, but I just got nothing from him. There might be additional context to his game from the feeds that could potentially change my opinion, but it was not covered on the episodes at all, hence me putting him here. He was very unthreatening, too unthreatening, and was seen as the funny guy to most of the house guests. He was very close to Andrew and was well liked, but he didn't seem to be aligned with the others and didn't really use his social game to improve himself strategically. He wasn't respected, as he was consistently put up as a pawn. He had enough awareness to know that it would eventually be his downfall, so he had a decent enough read on that. He was way too passive in the game, didn't do much strategically or make much strategic relationships. He was also unlucky, since he was an instant eviction and the HOH's thought of keeping him as a pawn was vocalized to the entire house. Maybe it would have changed if it was a normal double eviction or a normal week, but was still not a threat. If this didn't happen, I could see him lasting a bit longer, or quite a bit longer, but I don't think he would have enough respect from the jury to warrant a win. I don't think he had the killer instinct or the strategic acumen to really make the essential moves that needed to be made. I do think he would do okay if he were to return or was put on other seasons, but I just don't have faith in him to make the right moves socially or strategically, and he wasn't good competitively either. The next person I'm putting on this list at 11th is Tala. So, she was seen as a floater according to most of the house guests, but I'm pretty sure that it wasn't her intention to float between the power, and I'm sure she was a coaster instead, which is even worse. She didn't have many allies whatsoever, especially in the beginning of the season. It got to the point where she became an easy name to throw around as a target, just so people can either make a safe move, or so they wouldn't have to reveal their true target. Topaz's comment during the instant eviction when she was thinking to herself revealed this. It wasn't until about the end of week 6, if I remember correctly, where the house realized that they needed an extra number and the house was becoming split. Partially due to her relationship with Jillian, she sided with the East Coast Alliance, but they never respected her and only used her as a convenient number. She was also seen as expendable because she could not win a comp, though she came close in several. She was an emotional player and did not add much strategically, though she got very entitled when they wanted her to be on the block. And she had a lot of meltdowns in the house that annoyed people. Despite everything, she was a very fun person that the house enjoyed, and she would have won if she made it to the end. But this was due to some convoluted plan by the Shield to show that they still had power, so it wasn't even in respect for her as a person, or their like of her, or a respect of her as a player, but because they knew that her winning would be the biggest slap in the face and a joke. Nothing Tala really did was intentional, and if you threw her in another season, I can see her going home a lot earlier, and she wouldn't be a threat at all. I just don't have any capabilities or see any potential with Tala, hence her being in this category. So I am wrapping up the bad tier at 10th place with Tom, and he was someone who should have done a lot better than he ended up doing. He was able to get into an alliance that had a lot of control during the first few weeks of the season, and he was good in competitions. His main ally, Emmett, did want to go to the end of the game with him, and it seemed like some people did tolerate him enough at first, as he wasn't our target in the first few weeks. The issue is that Tom is a very emotional player. He wanted to target Andrew at one point because he saw him innocently talking to Liza. His alliance wanted Gary gone during his HOH, but he changed the target to Suzette because she was annoying him, and he made it very personal. He started throwing a bunch of names out to his alliance and got very hot-headed, causing them all to back away from him. He also revealed the Quattro Alliance to Liza because he was mad at his allies. He wasn't good strategically due to the reasons I stated above, mainly him being very emotional, and he had a hard time bonding and socializing with other people who were not like him. He had to be guided strategically by Emmett or Liza, and he was getting competitions, but that wasn't enough. It seemed like the house got rid of him mainly because they didn't like him and were annoyed at him, but they didn't really respect him as a player, and I don't think he has room to grow or has any potential if you put him on another season, so he is here. So this third tier is what I call potential. They have enough good in them and have enough bad in them, but not enough to be considered really good players or bad players. Many of these people had their time cut short before they could really prove themselves, and I feel like if they're in another environment or in another season, they could really thrive, so I don't think that they would be consistently bad players. Or they're here because they're just very inconsistent overall, and it's hard for me to put them under any category, despite the glimmering hopes of light that I do see in them as players, as well as their less than savory qualities. So at 9th place, the first person I'm going to put on this list is Anil. So no one trusted him from the very beginning because he came off as sketchy and untrustworthy. He intentionally tried to cause chaos amongst people, which did not help his case. I'm wondering if him being a superfan and this being the first chance for Canadians to play the game caused him to be a bit too excited, so he started doing a bit too much in this sense. He had the strongest alliance in the house targeting him from the very beginning, and it never let up, especially with Emmett being the figurehead of the targeting of him. Even though Alec, Peter, and to a lesser extent Tom started to somewhat warm up to him strategically, it didn't get him far at all. He was screwed over since he was booted due to the Canada's veto twist that had to be used, but there are people who did want him to stay around. He was starting to warm up to certain people, like Liza, but I don't think he would have lasted much longer even without the twist. Maybe would have been a late pre-juror or early juror at the very latest. Anil did have some good strategic reads, and he was one of the few who was sure about the boys' alliance, who was in it, and that he was in trouble, and saw through the motivations of many others. If you put him in different seasons, I could see him doing really well, and in other seasons, I could see him performing as he did here. But he was very, very unlucky, and a lot of unlucky people tend to find themselves in the potential list, as I did with my Total Drama Game Players ranking. There is only one other person that I'm putting in this category, and at 8th, I have Liza. So she is actually one of the better strategic players and one of the most self-aware players of the entire season. She had a set strategy of getting close to the guys and manipulating them, which she does somewhat successfully. She also intentionally went into the house to float between the power, and she did that pretty decently for the first few weeks. The issue is, everyone sees that this is what she does, and she does have a lot of great reads. She knew that Emmett was a problem, knew that there was a guys' alliance before Tom even told her, and she saw through most of the other house guests. I think the issue is, it was clear that everyone knew that she was on to them. She was decent socially for the first few weeks, and even had solid relationships with the girls and some people like Anil, but she thought she was a much better social player than she really was, and people saw her as inauthentic and sneaky. She threw people under the bus way too many times. A prime example of this is throwing Jillian under the bus about pitching a girls thing, which Liza did, but she blamed it on Jillian and told people that unnecessarily and was not good at planting seeds. She would have gone home in the week that she went home in either way, since Emmett won the first HOH that week before it was disqualified, and she would have went there, if not during the double in the same week. I do think if you put her in other seasons, she could do very, very well. I do think she would be the type to actually learn from her mistakes, so I do think she has a decent amount of potential. But there's not a whole lot that suggests she's a good player or really a bad player, in my opinion. She's just the perfect candidate for this tier. So the next tier I'm discussing is the Mediocre Tier. I don't think they are inconsistent players pertaining their variance. I don't think they have very high ceilings, but I don't think they have low ceilings either. They're okay players who did a decent amount right and some wrong. They're just in the middle, so that's where I'm going to place them. So at 7th place, I have Peter. So he was nowhere near as good strategically as he thought he was, but he did not make as many boneheaded decisions like Alec did. Of course, there was the choice of him not using the veto on Topaz in the final 6, voting out AJ over Andrew, who he was never aligned with, telling Liza information about his alliance while never turning on said alliance, and being transparent in his attempts to protect Liza to people in and out of his alliance. He knew how to lay low and when to lay low, and that was his best move strategically, especially compared to some of the others in the season. He did not make boneheaded decisions, or many bonehead decisions, and came off as unthreatening, though it became a detriment later on in the season because he wasn't threatening, and I don't know how much the jury would have respected him as a player. He was in the strong alliance in the beginning of the season, and seemingly played a part in turning on Tom, which caused him to be closer in allegiance with Gary and Topaz, but he ended up completely mishandling that. He didn't realize that the alliance with Emmett was over, and was never interested in taking a shot at Emmett and Jillian, but he became bitter when they started out blinking. At least when Alec was on his way out, or was targeted, he realized that he needed to get them out, but Peter was insistent on sticking with Emmett and Jillian and kissing up to them. I feel like if he had his own strategies instead of trying to replicate Dan and Will, he would have done much better, but I don't think he would do better as consistently as an Alec if he threw them on a bunch of other seasons. That's why I'm ranking Peter lower. At 6th place, I am ranking Gary. And yes, one of the main reasons why he is here is because he was evicted very early on in the jury portion, and he had severe luck and conveniences that caused him to somewhat win the season and to even come back later on in the game as the end game had already taken place, as it was a vote, not due to anything that he actually did as a game player. There was no skill that caused him to come back, but because he was seen as likable by America, actually no, by Canada, and that was clearly based off of the edits that they chose to give him because he was a producer favorite. So that was a huge convenience, and I'm thanking him a lot, as that's why he is here. Gary was on the outs from the very beginning and had trouble immersing himself into the majority of the house for most of his stay in the house. His allies kept on going home throughout the pre-jury, and he was never a serious target in the pre-jury of the season. He wasn't really poor strategically, but he wasn't good either. He saw taking out Tom as this huge move, but the latter made a deal with him in the prior week and kept his word, while his allies actually wanted Gary out, and it wasn't a big move. So I'm kind of thinking maybe Gary should have targeted someone else that wasn't Tom. So he was able to get into the good graces with Alec and Peter, but they saw and treated it as a fake alliance, and they threw him to the wolves when it wasn't in their best interest to do so. He had a good relationship with Emmett, but he didn't use it until he came back into the house and Emmett wanted him in his back pocket. He needed to be convinced by Dan to boot Emmett, as the house saw him as very emotional, but he still ended up doing it. He was good in competitions and was willing to make big moves, or what he perceived to be big moves, which is more than what most of the house guests did in the season. Still, his game, as we saw it twice, is only conducive enough for him to make it to the halfway point in a season on average, and while he was explaining his game in the finale, he mainly just said he worked hard and he talked about his personality and being himself. He didn't really go much into depth about the moves he made, the strategies he executed, so on and so forth. So it seemed like he either wasn't aware of the gameplay that he had, or there wasn't a lot anyways. He also got to spend 2 weeks with the jurors, where they all talked about who they did not want to win and who they wanted to win, as they were all under the impression that they weren't going to go back into the house. So he had that information and used it, so it put him in an unfair playing ground compared to the others who never went to the jury. and didn't have direct information being fed to them. At 5th place, I am ranking Alec. So I feel like he was actually pretty good socially, especially compared to Peter, as Alec was more comfortable talking to many different people and he wasn't as introverted as Peter. Most of the house really liked him and was able to cause him to lay a low profile for a lot of the season. He was also a very good competitor and knew how to bond with people outside of his alliance, like Gary, but he also overestimated his ability in this, as we saw with Andrew. The issue was, he wanted to be a lot like Will and Dan, and his strengths socially started to be overshadowed by his strategic blunders. These blunders involved overtly throwing Topaz under the bus, maybe turning on Tom a bit prematurely, voting out AJ over Andrew, blatantly throwing competitions to the point where other people notice it, throwing comps that he should not have thrown, like his final HOH and veto comps. He also had too much blinding trust with Emmett and had to be told a lot of information from Topaz, which he did not take advantage of. It did seem like when things were turning around negatively for him, he did start to have a bit more awareness on the moves he needed to make in his final round, compared to Peter at least, where he knew that Emmett and Jillian, as well as Andrew, needed to go, and he regretted some of the moves he made earlier on, which is more than I could say for Peter. I do believe if he was thrown in other seasons, he would do a lot better compared to Peter, so that's why I ranked Alec higher. In 4th place, and the final person in this mediocre tier, is Topaz. So she actually had a lot of great reads in the house, and I think in the house, she's the 2nd or 3rd best in this specific element. She knew the motivations of a lot of other people, knew the moves that needed to be made, and knew how to connect things together strategically. She was pretty good in competitions, and her laying low for a decent amount of the season caused people to underestimate her. Whether it was strategy or not is debatable, and something I am not sure about. She wasn't great socially, but she was in a good position for the first half of the season, where she had solid relationships with many people in the house. It wasn't until her HOH reign, where she was screwed over, where all of her relationships were ruined. She did become too emotional at times with her arguments with Tom and Liza, though she was in the majority in that sense and situation, her showman's drama with Alec, and her fight with Tala, which did her no good and caused people to start seeing her as a joke, or even more of a joke. Her allies, especially Alec and Peter, saw her as extremely expendable, and they didn't value her opinion, which is not good, because it was in their best interest to listen to her. When your showman votes against you on your HOH, throws you under the bus, and his ally does not save you in the final 6, when it's valuable for him to do so and it's the end game, it means that there's a lack of respect there. I do think if she was put on later seasons, where the house guests were more open to interacting with people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, I do think she would have thrived more, and I do think she has more capability to learn from her mistakes compared to some of the others that I ranked below her. Now we are moving on to the solid tier, and these are people who officially are not bad players or at all, or they have more skills that are leading towards the good side than the bad side. So if they are on a balancing scale, it tip over into that direction. And these are people who are on the higher end of skill sets, needed to thrive in Big Brother, but they just don't master it. So the bronze prize of 3rd goes to Andrew. So he was actually very good socially, especially in the beginning of the season. He was significantly older than everyone else in the house, but he was able to blend in with the younger house guests while also not trying to act like their age, which is something a lot of older house guests tend to do. People felt comfortable with him, and it caused for him to lay low. He allowed his social skills to carry him throughout the first half of the season, and he didn't need to make alliances or overplay. He was good in competitions, as he was able to win 3 or 4 throughout the season, and performed well in other competitions that he didn't end up winning. I think he was okay strategically, where he did do a good enough job of not overplaying, making a bunch of deals, or getting paranoid, which caused him to lay low. At the same time, he never looked at anything strategically beyond the surface, and he just wanted to go to the end with the East Coast Alliance. Did not see that they were turning on him, and did not see that he needed to catch them in order to win, since they were not taking him to the end, and he was not a jury threat, according to the tea that Gary spilled. And he was also fine with losing to Emmett and Jillian. He didn't understand that there was more than one way of playing the game, and he couldn't understand perspectives of other game players who didn't think like him. And I think that's his flaw in the final few weeks of the season. We are moving on to the silver prize, and that second is Jillian, which is ironic because she was supposed to place second in Big Brother Canada 1 overall. So I think she was solid socially, as she did get along with mainly everyone for the first portions of the season, and she never caused any conflict. People did want to work with her, and it seemed she was a sweetheart, which she used to her advantage, but it did cause things to be more complicated when she decided to cut people and to break deals. Strategically, I do think she was lacking. There were many moments in the season where Emmett had to encourage Jillian to make a deal with someone, like Tala. He encouraged her to make certain nomination choices, like nominating Anil instead of Danielle, breaking her word to Topaz about nominations, etc., and encouraged Jillian to calm down when she had her more scatterbrained moments. But I do respect her and give her props for knowing when to make the tough choices, owning those moves, demanding respect, and being willing to make big moves that needed to be made. Having that instinct is something that a lot of players lacked in the season, and it caused their downfall, which she didn't have an issue with. At the same time, she was willing to go to the end with Andrew, wanted to keep Andrew since she had this quote-unquote deserving mindset that Andrew also had. It was her choice to keep Peter when Emmett did not want him to go, so that was a moment where she stuck to her guns. Jillian had no concept of jury management, which bit her in the ass and caused for the jury to not respect her. Of course, she is great at competitions and is a major component of her game, but maybe a bit too much of it is a major component, where I don't know how good of a player she would be or if she would thrive the same way without competitions. I do think if you threw her in most seasons, she would do well enough. I don't really see her being an own reboot, but I don't know if she would thrive like she did in this season. I am skipping the good tier because I don't feel like there's anyone in this season who fits in that tier specifically. But there is one person who fits in the great tier, and this is the top of the top, someone who is very multifaceted and very strong in virtually all the skill sets needed to thrive in Big Brother, and someone who I feel like would do well in any season they are put in. So, unsurprisingly, Emmett is number one, and it's interesting that he was nominated on the first night and was on the block for the entire week. So he had to get into the game immediately, and I think being nominated the first week actually helped him focus on the game and learn the ropes very quickly since he was in jeopardy early on, though he wasn't really going to go home anyways. He knew how to control his emotions and or thoughts, at least unless it involves a competition, as he is cut for cheating at some point and snaps. Anyways, outside of that, he keeps his cool with the others, knows when to be quiet so he can observe and listen to other people, and lets people feel important, and so they can give him their trust. He is very good socially due to all this, and he was able to bond with many different people who are not like him. He is very good at competitions, though he does not win a lot of competitions early on. I don't know if he was throwing competitions or not, but it just showed that he was not reliant on competitions, especially compared to Jillian. He had great read strategically from beginning to end. He knew that Anil was trouble and was onto him, just like he knew that Liza was trouble and was onto him, where most of the house was not onto him, so he quickly got them out. He knew when to let Tom go, even though it hurt him, and he wanted to take Tom to the end without completely throwing him under the bus, but knew that Tom was detracting from his own game. He knew when to pivot alliances while still having influence over his old alliance, as we saw how he dealt with Alec and Peter throughout the jury phase, knew when to make side deals, and knew when to become self-interested. I forgot how great and on point he was strategically. Like, I was shocked once I rewatched the season, though I knew he was good. I just forgot how great he was. And he was always one step ahead of the curve. There was an issue with jury management or perception where he does lose against many of the people in the endgame outside of Jillian. But if you really look into it, it's not because of anything Emmett does, as he doesn't burn the jury. He doesn't have bad management with any of them by anything that he did. But they felt this way because they felt like rewarding him with a win against anyone that isn't Jillian is rewarding Jillian. So this wasn't even about him, but about Jillian, which is just ridiculous. Anyways, Emmett is one of the best players of Big Brother Canada, which we knew 10 years ago, but that has remained 10 years later. So I think that's a huge compliment, especially because he did not watch the show before he was on this season, so he really didn't have a template for anything. And he played being himself, essentially, unlike many of the others in the season who were trying to play like other people on Big Brother US, and it bit them in the butt. He showed people in Canada that you have to create your own path and your own strategy and be your own character, and you will thrive. So that is my ranking and tiers on how I rank the Big Brother Canada 1 cast as players. So there's really one great player, a few solid players, a few bad players, but everyone else is kind of in the middle, whether they are mediocre or have missed potential. Overall, I think this is a okay cast strategically, a few gems, a few duds, and everyone's kind of sprinkled out in between. I'm definitely looking forward to going through all the other seasons. I'm going to watch Big Brother Canada 2 soon and then start the process all over again, where I will review the season week by week and by house guest, and that'll be a longer video, and then I'll do a separate video ranking the cast based off their gameplay, like I did for the BBCAN1 cast and like I've done previously with the Total Drama cast. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back soon. Take care.